the American Civil War broke out in 1861, both sides were confident that this war would be over quickly. But instead, by the end of 1862, it was clear that the war was going to be a long, protracted one, a war of attrition. But by 1863, the greater material resources of the Union in respect to its manpower and its supplies, that began to work against the Confederacy and work to the advantage of the Union. The Union strategy, known as the Anaconda strategy, worked successfully. It slowly choked the life out of the Confederacy and eventually compelled the exhausted South to surrender in 1865. In this lesson, we're going to examine, first of all, the relative advantages that both sides enjoyed in this conflict, which is why it was a stalemate by the end of 1862. Second of all, we're going to look at why the Southern strategy in this war failed and while the Union strategy, the Anaconda strategy, was successful. Now, let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of both sides. Now, first of all, the North had a great advantage in terms of population. At the beginning of the war, the Union had about 21 million people, while the South had about 9 million. So more than a 2-to-1 advantage. So the North could produce more soldiers than the South could. Another thing about the South was that about almost 50% of its population were African Americans, and they were not going to be part of the army. They were needed to work on the plantations. So the North could draw on its entire adult male population, while the South could not. Now, toward the end of the war, as the South got desperate, they actually tried to recruit African Americans into their armies by promising them freedom and emancipation, but it was too little too late. So the North definitely had a great advantage in terms of the manpower resources. The North also had a tremendous advantage in terms of its ability to manufacture supplies. You know, in a war, you need guns, you need cannon, you need uniforms, you need ammunition. And at the beginning of the war in 1861, 80% of the nation's factories were located in the North. So basically, if the Confederacy wanted manufactured goods, if it wanted arms, it had to get them by importing them from Europe. It had to export its cotton in order to get goods from Europe, military hardware. Another thing about the South was that since they had to grow cotton to export to get the arms that they needed, they had to devote a good deal of their acreage to producing cotton rather than foodstuffs for the troops in the field. The North didn't have that problem. They could devote all of their farmland to mass-producing food to feed their armies in the field. So the North enjoyed a tremendous advantage both in food supplies and in material supplies and war supplies. Now, another advantage of the North was its railroads. Remember, before the war, the North invested in railroads and built railroads. The South did not invest in railroads as much. So as a result, during the war, you see, the North could get their supplies to their troops in the field very quickly because they had railroads to get the supplies to the front lines. The South did not have the same degree of railroads, so they had a hard time getting supplies to their troops in the field. The Southern armies were always lacking in supplies for the whole duration of the war. Another advantage of the North was that they had a much stronger financial system to pay for the war. You see, first of all, the North possessed a number of strong privately owned banks. Remember, the centers of finance were like Wall Street in New York City. In 1863, the federal government passed the National Banking Act. What this National Banking Act did was it allowed private banks basically the power to issue banknotes that could serve as money. They basically gave banks the right to print their own money. But in order to be able to print money, they had to purchase government bonds in gold. So that ensured that the federal government had a lot of money. They could sell government bonds to these banks and then use those bonds to pay for the war. The federal government also printed money of its own. In 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. What the Legal Tender Act did was that it allowed the government to print what we call promissory notes. and these promissory notes could be used as currency. A promissory note is where you say that at a later date people could exchange the value of the note for gold. Now these notes, these promissory notes, became known as greenbacks because they were printed on green papers. They're the predecessors of our current dollars that we use. Now these greenbacks were printed to the amount of $431 million. So a good deal of the war was paid for by printing these greenbacks. Now, of course, over time, due to inflation, the value of a greenback dollar declined. So a greenback dollar that was worth $1 in 1862 was worth about 50 cents in 1865. Now, one reason why the greenback dollar remained relatively stable and inflation didn't take too much of a toll was because it was backed by a federal government that could secure a fairly healthy revenue stream. For one thing, the U.S. government collected tariffs, and they could use those tariffs to pay for themselves. The United States government also issued a temporary wartime income tax. It taxed the wealthiest Americans at a rate of about 10%. So with taxes and tariffs, the United States government was able to pay for about 21% of the whole cost of the war. The rest of the 79% they had to pay for by borrowing money by selling bonds. Now, you contrast it with the Confederacy. They were not nearly in the same situation. First of all, they didn't have the same network of private banks to draw from. So basically, the Confederacy had to pay for the war by issuing promissory notes, Confederate dollars. During the course of the war, the Confederacy issued about $2 billion worth of promissory notes. Now, the Confederate currency suffered from severe inflation. Just to give you an example, in 1865, a Confederate dollar was, 1865, a Confederate dollar had the buying power of about 2 cents. Contrast that with the greenback. A greenback dollar was worth 50 cents in 1865. A Confederate dollar was worth 2 cents. So in southern towns especially, inflation took a terrible toll on the local economies. Now, one reason why you had such high inflation for Confederate currency is because people didn't have a lot of faith in the Confederacy, its financial system, because it did not have a healthy revenue stream. In the Confederacy, they collected no tariffs. In fact, the Constitution of the Confederacy specifically prohibited the imposition of tariffs, so they couldn't collect tariffs. Now, they tried to have an income tax of like 1%, but because Confederate states believed in states' rights, most state governments refused to collect the tax. So over the course of the war, taxes paid for only 1% of the entire cost of the war. That meant that 99% of the cost of the war was paid for by issuing these promissory notes that were very inflationary. So the Confederacy really had a disadvantage in terms of its financial resources. Now, despite all that, the reason why the war was a stalemate is because the South did have a certain key advantages over the Union. First of all, most of the war was fought on Southern soil. You see, most of the Civil War battles were fought in Tennessee and Virginia. So in most of the wars that were fought, the Confederate armies enjoyed the support of the local civilian population. And we saw this when we talked about the Revolutionary War. In those days, the only way to gather intelligence was from the locals. So now in the South, a lot of the folks resented the Union armies as a bunch of Yankees, and so for the most part, the civilian population supported the Confederate armies in the field so that they could, that gave them a source of supplies, that gave them strategic intelligence about the enemy, it gave them information about local terrain, and that generally gave the Confederate forces a huge advantage over the Union forces when they were fighting in the Southern theater. Now when the war was fought up north, like when the Confederacy invaded Pennsylvania in 1863, they were actually shocked when the Confederates were shocked when they didn't have local support or local population supporting them. Now, another key advantage that the Confederacy enjoyed was that for most of the war they had superior military leadership. In fact, if you add up all the wars fought in the Civil War, the Confederacy actually won a lot more battles than the Union ever did. And the reason for that was that when it came to strategy and leadership, the South enjoyed a huge advantage. You see, in the South, for Southern gentlemen, if you were a member of the planter class, a military career was an honorable career. So the majority of the people who graduated from places like West Point or from military academies were Southerners. And also, Southern generals had gained a lot of valuable military experience because many of them had served as junior officers during the Mexican War. So Southern generals enjoyed experience and knowledge that was far superior to the Union generals. Now, the Union generals at the beginning of the war were just terrible for most of them. Very few of them had had any military experience or training. A lot of times, generals and officers were promoted based on their political connections with the Republican Party. In fact, if you look at a lot of the Confederate victories, such as the Peninsular Campaign in 1862 in Virginia, the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, a lot of the success of the Confederate armies in these battles was due to the fact that the Union generals were incompetent. George McClellan, incompetent. Ambrose Burnside's super incompetent. Joseph Hooker, really incompetent. I mean, Burnsides and Hooker are only famous because Burnsides gave his name to sideburns and Joseph Hooker gave his name to prostitutes, hookers. So these guys didn't really have a whole lot of going for them. And meanwhile, the South had a very inspirational and charismatic leader in Robert E. Lee, who had a lot of experience even before the war broke out. So as a result, the war was a stalemate. Now, over time, though, the inferior advantages of the South would hurt them, and they would eventually lose the war. Now, another problem that the South faced was that their own strategy was not effective. They were never able to break the stalemate that had broken out by 1862. Now, the South did have a plan. I mean, they did have a strategy. Their plan was this. First of all, their plan involved winning some decisive victories over the Union. And they hoped that if they won some decisive victories over the Union, maybe on Union soil, then that would be enough to get European powers like Great Britain and France to formally recognize the independence of the Confederacy and join them as allies. They believed that this would happen because nations like Great Britain and France were dependent, they believed, on American cotton, and that dependency on cotton would make them want to ally themselves with the Confederacy. Another part of this plan was that the North would, over time, become demoralized, that when they saw that they could not defeat the South, that they'd get tired of the war and then just give up and then just out of exhaustion recognize the independence of the Confederacy. Now, this plan was based on the strategy or the experience that the United States had in winning its independence from Great Britain back in 1783. They hoped in the 1760s, they hoped to do what the United States had done back in the 1770s and 1780s with Great Britain. Now, there were a number of problems with this strategy. One of the big problems with this strategy was that the Union in the 1860s, the public in the Union in the 1860s was not the same as the British public's opinion in the 1770s. You see, the war in the North was never as unpopular as the Revolutionary War had been in Great Britain. For the most part, Americans in the North were supportive of Lincoln and the war. Many Northerners felt that this war was about saving the Union. They believed that the Union was sacred, that Union was, a part of God's providence, and somehow the Southern rebels were a bunch of ungodly, barbarous, murderous traitors. These rebels that needed to be crushed to save the Union. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't some opposition within the Union to the war, especially when the war was not going well for the Union in 1862 and 1863, when the Union was suffering a slew of defeats. In the Midwest, like in Ohio and Indiana, there were certain Democrats known as Copperheads, who were very vocal in their opposition to the war and were demanding that the United States end the war and immediately recognize the independence of the Confederacy. A lot of folks in the Midwest, remember, had ties, family ties to folks in Kentucky and Tennessee. In the Midwest, for example, there were secret societies like the Order of American Knights who were pledged to fighting against the Republicans and ending the war and recognizing the independence of the Confederacy. There was some opposition to the draft. When the United States issued a draft to bring more soldiers into the Union, there were massive draft riots in New York City. A lot of the people rioting were Irish immigrants in New York City who were opposed to the war, and they took out their hostility against the free African American population in the city, and a number of African Americans were lynched. They actually had to bring federal troops into New York City to crush these draft riots. But despite all that, in general, the population of the North remained supportive of the war. Now, in 1864, the people of the North had a chance to make their voice heard. In 1864, Lincoln was running for re-election, and his Democratic opponent was the former Union General George McClellan. Now, McClellan was calling for an immediate end of the war and through some kind of negotiated settlement. But Lincoln, of course, was calling for continuing the war and crushing the rebellion. Now, in the election, Lincoln won pretty handily. He won 55% of the popular vote, and a lot of his, some people, historians think a lot of his victory might have been due to the fact that just before the election, Union forces captured the city of Atlanta and Mobile, Alabama, and that might have been a factor in people rallying behind Lincoln and winning, the Republicans winning that election. So the North was not about to give up. So that worked against the Southern strategy. Another problem for the Southern strategy was that they never were able to win a foreign alliance. Now, in Great Britain, the conservative government of Great Britain at the time, as well as the ruler of France, Napoleon III, they both sympathized with the Confederacy. Both of them had textile industries that relied heavily on American cotton imports. But you see, in both of these countries, though, France and Great Britain, the general population was opposed to slavery. Now, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln took action, and this action was he announced the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a key strategic move by Lincoln. You see, the Emancipation Proclamation was to go in effect January 1st, 1863. And what this Emancipation Proclamation did was to grant freedom to all slaves under rebel territory, under rebel control. And in one stroke of a pen, by announcing the Emancipation Proclamation, all of a sudden this war was a war against slavery. And all of a sudden, over in France and over in Great Britain, public opinion switched in support of the Union. I mean, people in France and Great Britain, they supported the Union because they were against slavery, and the public would never support an alliance with the Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation was very important for denying the Confederacy the chance at winning foreign recognition and a foreign alliance. Another thing about the Emancipation Proclamation that was really important was it really kind of boosted the morale of the Union, killed two birds with one stone. The abolitionists, now they came on board as some of the strongest supporters of Lincoln and the strongest supporters of the war. So by announcing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln in effect gained all these very zealous supporters who were going to have his back. Another thing that Lincoln did was that by announcing the Emancipation Proclamation, he denied the South a lot of labor. You see, what happened once the Emancipation Proclamation was proclaimed, there were African Americans living in slavery who thought, hey, what am I doing here? If I can escape this plantation, I can be free. So you had a case where thousands and thousands of African Americans got away from the plantations, and many of them volunteered to serve as soldiers in the Union armies. And they served well and excelled. So the Emancipation Proclamation actually deprived the Confederacy of much of its workforce. So it was really a tremendous strategic move by Abraham Lincoln. Now, another problem with the Southern strategy was that the Southern strategy was supposed to win a major victory on Union soil. You see, the Confederacy won a lot of battles, but when it won a lot of these battles, it was on the defensive. You know, Union armies were invading the South. So it was important for the Confederacy to win a major victory on Union soil. Now, in 1862, with this in mind, Robert E. Lee launched a major campaign into Maryland. But at the Battle of Antietam in 1862, the battle ended in a draw, and basically he had to withdraw back into Virginia. The very next year, in July of 1863, Robert E. Lee launched another invasion. He launched an attack right into the heart of the Union. He invaded Pennsylvania. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, he suffered a major defeat. It was one of the few times that Robert E. Lee suffered a defeat, and they suffered heavy casualties in that battle. So the Gettysburg, for that reason, is one of the major turning points in the war, because Lee lost the battle, and it was the collapse of the Southern strategy. I mean, he could not win a battle on Union soil, and that was a major blow to the Southern strategy. Now, the Union strategy was called the Anaconda strategy, and it was able to work very effectively. And one of the reasons why it worked was that eventually the Union found two generals that knew what they were doing. It finally found successful generals to implement the Anaconda strategy. These two men were Ulysses S. Grant, who was at the bottom of his class at West Point, oh well, and the other person was William Tecumseh Sherman. And these two guys were able to take advantage of the Union's superiority in men and materials and employ unorthodox military tactics and basically just crush the life out of the Confederacy and the Confederate armies. Now, what was the Anaconda strategy? The Anaconda strategy was actually the brainchild of Winfield Scott. Remember Winfield Scott, former presidential candidate? One of the last things he did before he died, he was, in 1861, he was the commander-in-chief of Union forces. And just before his death, he put together this strategy to crush the rebellion. Now, it was called the Anaconda strategy because an anaconda snake strangles its victims. It strangles the life out of its victims. And the goal of the Anaconda strategy was to strangle the economic life out of the South. The plan, first of all, called for a blockade of the Atlantic and Gulf Coast of the South. This blockade by Union ships was designed to prevent the South from exporting cotton so that it could import weapons and supplies for its armies. And during the course of the war, the Union was effective in this blockade, and in fact, they captured New Orleans in 1862 and Mobile, Alabama in 1864, two very important ports of the South. Another part of this plan was to capture control of key waterways, like on the Mississippi and Tennessee rivers, because that's where the steamboats operated, and also gain control of the few key railroad junctions in major southern cities. Now, one of the key victories in the Anaconda strategy was the capture of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was captured by Union forces the same time that the Battle of Gettysburg was taking place in July of 1863. Vicksburg was important because it was in Mississippi, and it controlled the traffic along the lower Mississippi River. So whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the flow of traffic along the Mississippi River. Now, Grant used unorthodox tactics to capture the city. The city was pretty much impregnable. So if he had launched like frontal attacks on the city, it would have been a disaster. But what he did is he just surrounded the city, cut it off from any kind of support, and he just waited for its inhabitants to starve to death. When they'd starved to death, he just moved right in and took the city. Not very chivalrous, but it was effective. Now, in 1863, Lincoln finally had found two commanders. So he had his two guys were Grant and Sherman. And at the end of 1863, the key was to capture Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga, Tennessee, home of the Chattanooga Choo-Choo, was an important railroad junction. So it was important to capture this city. So what Grant did is that to try to capture Chattanooga, he just ordered his troops to engage and just assault the enemy in wave after wave after wave. Now these waves were deadly because basically Union troops were just going in and attacking the Confederate positions and being gunned down and gunned down. Now why did Grant do that? Well, he knew that he could just keep on bringing in new troops. You know, when a bunch of his troops died, he would just bring in the railroad, bring in new troops, and just put them back into the field. In fact, Grant's own troops, his own men, called him the butcher, because he was the butcher. He'd just bring in more men, more fresh meat to go against the enemy, and he'd just wear out the enemy till eventually they had to withdraw and Chattanooga was taken. Now, in 1864 and 1865, you had two armies. One army commanded by Sherman in the west, in Tennessee, the other commanded by Grant in Virginia. And these two generals were able to bring the Confederacy to its knees. Now, Sherman controlled Chattanooga. Now he marched on Atlanta. Now, Atlanta was another important railroad junction, just like Chattanooga. The Confederate commander at the time was from Texas. His name was David Hood. And he decided that he was going to try to draw off the Union Army he wanted to draw them away from Atlanta by marching right into the heart of Tennessee. He was going to try to retake Nashville, which was under Union control. Now, Sherman, he didn't take the bait. You know, Hood was hoping that Sherman would just follow him into Tennessee and that would relieve Atlanta. But Sherman knew that he had sufficient forces already in Tennessee, because Union had superior manpower, that he could continue to defend Nashville and continue his march on Atlanta. So what happened is that David Hood went to Nashville, and Sherman went straight to unguarded, undefended Atlanta, and he burned the city to the ground. It was argued that a raid earlier that year on Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, a Confederate raid, had burned Chambersburg to the ground, which it had. And so basically, to avenge that burning, Union troops burned Atlanta to the ground in 1864. Now, that army that marched on Nashville, they were defeated. One of the biggest battles in terms of numbers was fought just outside of Nashville. It's called the Battle of Franklin. And David Hood and his forces suffered defeat because Union armies were just too big and too many of them. Now, after his capture of Atlanta, Sherman decided to march to the Atlantic coast to take the important port of Savannah. And this is known as Sherman's March to the Sea. When Sherman made this march, he pledged that he was going to make Georgia howl. And on this march, Union armies took their case to the civilian population. They burned farmhouses, they killed livestock. Sherman's idea was to destroy the morale, to break the will of the Southern people. So he just took it to the Southerners. Many people call the American Civil War the first modern war because it was the first time that civilians were in the sights of the armies, that civilians suffered as much as soldiers in the field. Now, after he took Savannah, he decided to continue his march through South Carolina, burning and looting everything in his path. And he burned down Columbia, South Carolina, just like he burned down Atlanta, Georgia. Now, while Sherman was burning his way through Georgia and South Carolina, Grant was engaging the Army of Virginia under the command of Robert E. Lee. And the idea was for him to march on Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. Now, Grant and his army, they suffered a string of defeats at the Battle of Cold Harbor, at the Battle of the Wilderness, at the Battle of Spotsylvania. Again and again, Confederate forces won the day, and the Union armies suffered tremendous casualties. But the thing about Grant is that even when he suffered a defeat, he would keep on advancing. You see, he had the manpower. If he lost a bunch of troops, he could just refill his ranks and continue the march. But you see, Lee, when he lost men, and slowly he was losing men as every battle went on, even though he won the battles, he was still losing men. He had no reinforcements. He had no return of supplies. So the war was taking a toll on Lee's army. And Grant was just kept on coming at him with more troops and more reinforcements. Eventually, by April 9th, 1865, Lee, his army had ran out of supplies, his men were tired, they were running out of ammunition. So on April 9th, 1865, Lee formally surrendered to Grant's army at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And what happened next, over the next month, is that the entire Confederate forces collapsed, and resistance collapsed, and other Confederate forces surrendered. Now, President Lincoln would not live to see this final victory. On April 14th, 1865, just days after Appomattox, he was assassinated by actor John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate supporter, but he lived in Maryland, which was part of the Union anyway. But he hoped that by gunning down Lincoln, that he was executing a tyrant, and this would revitalize the Confederates' cause. But it didn't, and the war ended. And unfortunately, Lincoln was not there to be present in the reconstruction of the Union after this terrible war. In the next lesson, we're going to examine how the Union dealt with the issue of reconstruction, with reconstructing the Union in the absence of Lincoln's leadership.